afternoon. As I understand, you asked me to speak English. I would like to talk about the situation of children, mostly of girls, from religious minorities in Europe. I started to work on this. Unfortunately, the sharing of the screen is disabled. So if you could work on this, it would be fine. I started to work on this issue because I was interested in the situation of Christian girls in Nigeria, in Pakistan, where those girls are kidnapped, they are raped, they are enslaved, and there is no interest in Europe in what's going on there. I have to say that it's very impressive why Europe is not reacting in this kind of situations. The first thing is that when you are looking on Europe, it's very difficult to find any data referring directly to religious communities. Sorry, do pana Romana informacja. Dzielenie ekranu jest wyłączone. Gdyby pan mógł to włączyć dla mnie. There's no direct information on religious freedom of minorities, especially of children. So we can find mostly information concerning country of origin or ethnicity of victims or of predators of different on this ground we can try to the religion of those people. On the other hand, giving out information of perpetrators or victims is or can be seen as the evaluation of data protection rules, because everything which is linked especially to religion is regarded as sensitive data. So recently, just last week, we received information that, for example, medical professor Christina Sundqvist from Lund University was accused of an ethical breach in connection with research, showing that about 60% of people convicted of rape in Sweden between 2000 and 2015 had a migrant background. First approach is the question concerning slavery and human trafficking. So we know that slavery is forbidden in the international law, and even if not in our national constitutions in Europe, that's only because it is obvious that it is forbidden and that this phenomenon shouldn't exist. British research is showing that in Europe, that's from 2012 information, there is about 1,140,000 of people who are enslaved. When you look on the names of the countries which in which there is the biggest number of people who are enslaved, that's mostly the ex-communist countries in Europe. But we can say in every country you will find a certain number of people who are enslaved. And in this research, there is a number of reported victims and also the estimated dark number of slaves in every country, and this means that mostly under these estimations, 90% or more of people who are enslaved are not recorded as victims of enslavement. But we even don't use this word slavery today in Europe. We rather talk about human trafficking. Here in the word, that's from the European Parliament report information. So in 2012-14, there was an estimation that about 21 million of people were victims of forced labor and about 60,000 of trafficking. And when we are looking in more detail, so 54% that's sexual exploitation, 38% that's forced labor. And globally, more than 70% of victims are female, and 20% of them are girls even. In Europe, that's from 2013-14, so only 2 years, registered victims were about 16,000 and 67% for sexual exploitation, of which 95% were female and 21% for forced labor, and here 44% were male. So we see kind of specialization that the sexual exploitation mostly is touching women and girls. Forced labor were more boys and men. But 60% of victims are EU citizens. So that's a specificity that this is not only a phenomenon which is coming from abroad and touching only those who are foreigners, but 60% of victims, these are the EU citizens. And the main countries of origin of the victims is Romania, Bulgaria, but the Netherlands also, Hungary and Poland. Romania and Bulgaria, they are coming back many times in this kind of researches, because it is said that on the one hand, it's the purest country in the EU, and on the other hand, there is a quite big Roma community. So we see that 76% of victims of human trafficking in Europe were women and girls. And according to the European Commission, it is underreported. So the real number probably is much bigger. And 75% of convicted traffickers are male. So we see that women and girls mostly are the victims, and men are mostly the traffickers. And the biggest number of traffic people were coming from Bulgaria and Romania, from the EU countries. And when we are looking for non-EU countries, that's mostly China and Nigeria. And that's another research on the years 2017-2018, 14,000 registered victims in the EU. Nearly half of the victims are EU citizens, and also a significant number of trafficked are victims of trafficking within the member state. So mostly victims are trafficked for sexual exploitation, so these are women and girls, and almost every fourth victim of trafficking in the EU is a child. So here we have an information on children. And this is also this kind of crime is giving a big income to those perpetrators, and it is estimated that the cost of economic cost of this human trafficking, that's about 2.7 billion euro a year. That's another research, but just showing graphically of crimes linked with human trafficking, and also the percentage of both sex. So we can say that trafficking for sexual exploitation is mostly directed against women and girls, and nearly 3/4 of and 92% of sexual exploitation are women and girls. And there is a specificity of Roma communities, which is the most exposed for this kind of exploitation due to the poverty, but also due to anti-gypsies, low education, and so on. And especially we know that in the Roma community, girls are leaving schools for education. And 60% of child victims were trafficked for sexual exploitation, and 3/4 of all child victims in the EU were EU citizens. And 78% of child victims were girls in 2017-2018. So one of those abuses is forced work. When we are looking on the kind of crimes against children, so they are mostly trafficked for sexual exploitation, then for forced labor, but also there are other reasons like begging, organs removal, domestic servitude, and so on. And 32% of victims in Europe originate now from the Balkans. 90% of victims originate from former Soviet states, and 14% from South America, 7% from Central Europe. It means that this is showing also that with the years it is changing. So Central Europe became richer, so there is less victims from this region. And when we are looking on the phenomenon of forced labor, so there's about 21 million people who are victims at each moment. But we see that this phenomenon is existing also in the Western world. And here you see that's developed countries and with the EU, and that there is an annual profit of forced labor also in the EU about nearly $50 billion. What is specific with this human trafficking and children trafficking? So it was quite easy to find some data in the UK. So these are information from the report from 2009-10, and that year there were 287 children from 47 countries which were identified as potential victims of trafficking. Mostly they were coming from Vietnam, Nigeria, China, and they were Roma people. And mostly they were for sexual exploitation, so women and girls exploited for cannabis cultivation, and this is a kind of Vietnamese speciality, we can say. So domestic service, benefit fraud, labor exploitation, street crime, servant marriage, illegal adoption, other types of exploitation. 71% of this registered victims were between 14 and 17 years old. 56% female and 34 male. It's a phenomenon which is also for the police, for those who are dealing with this phenomenon, difficult to describe, because, for example, in the English report, you have an example that sometimes there is a family from Africa which is coming to the UK. They are leaving a child in the country and leaving then the family is leaving the UK. So the child is not attended and registered as trafficked. When he is getting the nationality, the citizenship, so the whole family is coming back to the UK for family reunification. Probably there are cases like this, but when you are looking on the second example from this report, you see that not all the authors of this report were treating this phenomenon seriously. So this is a list of different crimes which in which are use people who are trafficked and also children, and that's always in the UK. So you see the distinction between children and adults among the victims. Always there is a biggest number of adults, but also quite a big number of children. That's the foreigners who are arrested for cannabis-related offences in the UK. These are just the countries, and here the nationalities arrested for TIP in the UK. You also see that on the other hand, there's another specific specialization. That's here you have mostly Roma people. In cannabis, you had Vietnamese, but then also quite a big number of children arrested for this kind of crimes. And these are the nationalities here. The next phenomenon is so-called forced marriage. It is criminalized in 20 EU countries, so not in everyone. But it doesn't mean that it is tolerated, but just that in some countries there are no special rules on this kind of crime. Probably every day in the world there is about 37 to 39,000 young girls who are married before reaching the age of majority. And this means that this is about 14 million a year. And also forced marriages between adults are quite frequent. So in Europe, we can say that on the one hand, we have forced marriages concluded in Europe. Then forced marriages of European citizens or residents concluded elsewhere, or a person forced to marry before arriving to Europe. So these are three different groups of people, but a big part of them, they are leaving in Europe, or they are nationals in Europe. And mostly this is the way how the rights of women and girls are violated, but also sometimes of men and boys. And young girls marrying often they have to drop out the school. They are separated from the family. They are transforming quickly from childhood to adult life. There is a domestic slavery and unprotected and forced sexual relations and so on and so on. When we are looking on this term forced marriage, and in the report prepared by the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, you can find also this reflection that this term forced marriage is misleading. So in reality, it shouldn't be used, because marriage requires mutual consent and lack of coercion. So you cannot be forced to be married. This kind of marriage is invalid if there is no free consent. The use of this term also has some negative consequences for the life of victims. Nevertheless, this term is an umbrella term covering, for example, marriage as slavery, arranged marriage, traditional marriage, marriage for reasons of custom, expediency or perceived respectability, child marriage, early marriage, fictitious marriage, sham marriage, marriage of convenience, unconsummated marriage, putative marriage, marriage to acquired nationality, undesirable marriage. So these are different phenomena. But so when we are talking on this, it's important to understand this diversity. What is specific is here also the fact that mostly this is touching young girls. In England, in 2009, there was an estimation that about 500 to 800 cases were reported on forced marriage in England each year. Then in 2020, Forced Marriage Unit gave advice or support in 716 cases related to a possible forced marriage or possible female genital mutilation. And in this report, you find that there were 26% of victims below 18 years old, and 37 in the age 18-25, and 79% involved victims were female, and 21% were male. These are just the numbers of these incidents which were registered by this unit between 2011 and 2020. 2020, that as you see that there was, for a certain reason, I know smaller number of forced marriages, and this is the age of those involved in this kind of the age of victims of this crime. And these are the main countries. So we have Pakistan, Bangladesh, India, Afghanistan, Somalia. What is specific that besides India, these are Muslim countries. In Germany, you have some statistics that they are saying that there were 56 cases in 2012, but there is a German study saying that there is more than 3,000 cases a year. In the UK, there's a certain number here, 130 of protection orders. So this is not just the number of the victims of this so-called forced marriage, but when the police reacted in such a case and tried to protect people. In Sweden, they are providing us with a number of young people who were worried that they would not be allowed to choose whom they want to marry. And that's about 8,500 young people a year. And in France, there's a specificity that this non-consensual marriage was experienced, according to research, by 4% of migrant women, but only by 2% of daughters of migrants. So that probably this is diminishing from one generation to the other. Then you have female genital mutilation. In the world, that's about 200 million women and girls who are victims of this crime. And this is a phenomenon existing also in Europe, even if it's officially prohibited in all the EU countries. Terre des Femmes is estimating, for example, that in Germany there was about 58,000 of girls mutilated, and that every year that's about 10,000 to 13,000 of new victims. This is a custom which is common in Iraq, Eritrea, Somalia. So we can observe this in mostly in groups of these migrants. And Terre des Femmes is saying that, for example, concerning the German girls, so it is not committed in Germany. They are rather going to Paris. So there is a trip to Paris, or a big trip for celebration of something to the homeland. So they also are trying to warn girls at schools that if they hear about a big celebration, so probably they should contact police. There are also crimes of honor in Europe, also that's mostly against women. There was a phenomenon of missing children. So in Germany, in 2017, there were missing more than 6,000 migrants' children at the age of 14, 17. And the last phenomenon I would like to refer to is the gender side. The gender side means that women are victims of killing. There was an EU resolution from 2013 against the gender side, so on this phenomenon of missing women. And you know that globally there is about 200 million women missing in the world population. half of them are missing in China. You can check if this phenomenon is existing or not when just you are referring to the number of births of girls and boys. So in China, that's 140 to 100 boys to girls. In Vietnam, 112 to 200. And you have Albania, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia. It means also countries which are in Europe or in the Council of Europe, and you can observe this phenomenon. But for the first time, so the European Parliament was interested in this due to the fact that in Norway, sociologists they discovered that in some sectors of the society there's much less girls than boys, and this they identified that this was Pakistani migrant community where the fathers are killing the daughters. There is also the question of selective abortion, infanticide, and so on. So I think that here more or less we can stop on this. Just as a conclusion, there is when we are talking about religious freedom of children from religious minorities. So on the one hand, you can see that the state institutions, the Council of Europe or European Union is interested in this kind of crimes, but never is mentioning religion in this case. So whenever you would like to get their support for example, Christian girls from Nigeria who are raped and enslaved, they will not be interested in this case. But if you are able to present this as a feminist issue, so you will not mention that religion is playing an important role in this phenomenon. So they can be an interest also on the side of EU politicians, and I think Council of Europe is more open also for religion. So there are some countries which can introduce this religious topic, but rather not in the EU. So in my understanding, if you would like to get support for children who are victims of different crimes in the world, it's important to show that this is just a part of what's going also in Europe, so that on a different scale and in a different legal framework, but we are facing the same phenomenon, and so we should treat this globally. Thank you.
Thank you, Reverend Professor Mazurkiewicz, for your presentation. If any one of you has questions for our speaker, you can ask these questions because our speaker hears us. Okay, in the meantime, I would like to invite Professor Luis Oviedo to join me here for his presentation. Thank you.
I did have one question, just specifically about Iraq and some of the Yazidi children that were taken captive after the ISIS invasion in 2014 and following. My understanding is that many of the women and children that were enslaved are still in captivity or still missing, and just wondering what is being done and what groups are working to still locate them.
You see, I have not referred to the question of ISIS and Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on, because mostly I mentioned the nationalities of those who are victims on European soil. But I was in touch with the Iraqi Christians, with Yazidis, and I just can start with an example because I met at a conference a woman from Iraq who is working in Oxford at the university, and we talk about during a conference on Christians in Iraq, on disappearance of Christians and so on, and she wanted to excuse and explain her positions why she had left Iraq. And she said, we were there as Christian family till the moment when all the men were killed in our family, and remained only our mother and 3 or 4 sisters. And we wanted to avoid that we will be forced to become Muslims. So the only way how to avoid this forced conversion was to escape from Iraq. So when we are looking on Iraq, there's a war context. So in this war context, sexual violence against women is a kind of weapon. We well experienced this during the Balkan War in Europe, so that men are killed and women are raped. And this is treated as a kind of, so that's not just for sexual pleasure, but this is also to humiliate the population to which belong women. And on the other hand, if these women are pregnant, so they are giving birth to a child whose father is an enemy. So this is why this is used during the war. And on the other hand, there were also in Iraq attacks against the buses with girls going to the university in Mosul. So that it's very clear that when you compare the position of women in a Muslim culture and in Christianity, it's very different. And those attacks against those women students was provoked by the fact that the ISIS military, they were convinced that they should not be educated, so that the offense was that girls are becoming students. On the other hand, I met with some Christians from Pakistan, and their rape is used as a way to force a Christian woman to become usually the 4th wife of a Muslim and to convert her to Islam. So distinction between Muslim and Christian women is so visible, so that when you have in countries like, for example, Pakistan, you have a man who is Christian and the other who is Muslim or is belonging to other religion. So you don't see on the street at once at first glance the distinction of religion. But when you see a Christian woman, so she's behaving totally different way because she is conscious of her dignity, and this is something that they are very easy target for some Muslims. In Pakistan, that's just fundamentalists. In countries like Iraq or Afghanistan, you have ISIS, you have Talibs, and so on. We see, for example, now in Afghanistan, the situation that this violence is directed not only against Christian girls or Christian women, but also against Muslim women and girls who are not behaving the way that the Taliban want them to behave. We can say that there are customs which are directly linked with religion and religious tradition in some countries, like, for example, with the genital mutilation of girls. This is older than Islam. So it's true that this custom is exists only in Muslim communities, but only in some, and not overall. And then you have, yes, okay, that's that. Option.
Thank you very much, Reverend Professor Mazurkiewicz.